Some nights carved themselves into the road like scars, quiet, brutal, unforgettable, and on the night they left Frank Dalton alone in the Mojave, the desert didn't stay silent. It listened, it remembered, and it carried the truth to the men who would not ignore it. Frank wasn't just old, he was the kind of old that comes from surviving things most men don't. A former medic, a father of 3, and a rider long before grey hair found him, Frank knew the desert better than the young punks who dragged him out of his truck and dumped him miles from the nearest road. They thought he was weak, they thought he was harmless, but what they didn't know and what they couldn't know is that Frank Dalton had brothers, not by blood, by asphalt, and asphalt remembers. When the bikers found Frank's abandoned truck at a gas station outside Ridgecrest, driver's door open, blood on the gravel, keys still in the ignition, the air changed. A stillness settled over the pumps, the kind of silence that arrives 5 seconds before a storm breaks. A single question hung between them: who would dare lay a hand on a man like Frank Dalton? That night, while the desert cooled and the sky turned black, 40 riders kicked their engines to life. Not out of revenge, not out of anger, out of respect, out of a code older than the dust beneath their tires. And before sunrise, the men who left a veteran to die would learn something the road had been teaching for decades. You don't abandon one of ours. Not out here, not ever. Some stories don't begin with guns or engines. They begin with a mistake, the kind a man wishes he could take back the moment he realizes the weight of it. That's what happened the night Frank Dalton disappeared. Frank wasn't just a rider. He was the quiet type. The kind who showed up when someone's bike broke down on a lonely stretch of highway. The kind who never missed a funeral, never forgot a birthday, and never left a man stranded, no matter how far out in the desert he had to ride to find him. So when word spread that Frank's truck had been found abandoned on the edge of the Mojave, door open, blood on the ground, no sign of him anywhere, it was more than a mystery. It was an insult, a violation of a code older than the boots on their feet. The men who rode with Frank didn't speak much that night. They didn't need to. A veteran who'd patched up soldiers in a war half the country has already forgotten, now left alone beneath a desert sky. It didn't sit right, not with anyone. And when bikers feel something that deeply, the road starts to move. But before we step into this story, before we relive the miles, the tracks in the sand, the headlights carving through the dark, take a moment, feel the desert wind, smell the dust, hear the low rumble of engines waking up one by one. This isn't a tale about revenge. It's a tale about respect, about brothers who don't let an old man disappear without a fight. If this kind of storytelling speaks to you, consider subscribing and hit the like button. It keeps these roads alive. And if you've lived a road story worth telling, share it in the comments or send it privately through the link below. Maybe your ride becomes the next chapter we bring to life. Frank Dalton never liked drawing attention. At 79, he'd mastered the art of blending into the parts of life most people overlook. The diner booth no one sits in, the corner of the gas station where the old-timers gather, the back of the bar where the neon lights don't quite reach. He was quiet, steady, reliable, a man who spoke only when silence wasn't enough, but everyone in Ridgecrest knew who he was. They knew him from the way he walked, slow, measured, that slight limp from a wound he never talked about. They knew him from the way he listened, with patience, with care, like every word someone said mattered. And they knew him from the way he rode, calm, controlled, a man who had nothing left to prove. Frank didn't ride for glory anymore. He rode because the road felt like the only place where the world made sense. Out there, under an endless desert sky, the memories didn't feel so heavy. They spread out. They got quieter. Maybe that's why he didn't notice the trouble when it started. It began earlier that afternoon at the Blue Coyote gas stop, a dusty little station at the edge of nowhere. Frank had pulled in for water, maybe a coffee, maybe just a moment to stretch his legs before heading deeper into the Mojave. A pickup truck with 4 young men was already there, music blaring, beer cans clattering on the floorboard. Frank didn't pay them any mind. He nodded politely, grabbed a bottle of water and walked back to his truck. But sometimes the world has a way of putting the wrong people in the path of a good man. One of the kids, tall, sunburned, wearing a sleeveless shirt with a skull on it, didn't like the way Frank ignored him. He stepped in front of the veteran, blocking his path. "Hey," he said, "ain't you gonna say something?" Frank looked up at him, tired but calm. "What would you like me to say, son?" The kid smirked. "I don't know. Respect, maybe. You old folks think you own the road." Frank shook his head. "No one owns the road." The other boys laughed. It wasn't real laughter. It was the kind men use when they're trying to impress each other, the kind that turns sour fast. Frank tried to sidestep, but the kid grabbed his arm. "Hey, I'm talking to you." Frank's eyes hardened, just for a moment. "Let go." The kid did, but only so he could shove him back. Frank stumbled, caught himself, and stood still. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't raise a hand. He didn't yell. Veterans like him didn't escalate. They endured. They outlasted. But to boys who'd never been tested by anything real, patience looked like weakness. And weakness looked like permission. The smallest of the four whispered something. The others nodded. Frank could tell something was about to happen, but he couldn't have predicted how far they would take it. Things escalated quickly. Too quickly. A blow to the side of his ribs, a hand gripping his collar, a punch he didn't see coming. The desert swallowed the sounds, dull thuds carried away by miles of open sand. When it was over, the boys dragged Frank to his truck, half-conscious, slipping in and out of awareness. They loaded him in the back like cargo, laughing as they climbed into their pickup. Frank tried to speak once, but his voice cracked. The desert wind swallowed the words. The truck bounced off the road, deeper into the Mojave. No cell signal, no lights, no passing cars, nothing but the wide-open nothingness stretching in every direction. A few miles in, they stopped. "Good luck, old man," the sunburned one said, shoving Frank out onto the sand. "Hope your biker friends come save you." They left him with no water, no truck, no chance of walking out before dark. As the taillights disappeared, Frank lay still, listening to the quiet settle around him. The kind of quiet you only hear in places where no one expects to die. Then, with effort, he turned onto his side and saw something glinting near a rock. A metal object, his dog tags, ripped from him in the struggle. He reached out, fingers trembling, and closed his hand around them. If the desert didn't take him before morning, maybe someone else would know what he never said out loud. He hadn't disappeared by accident, and the men who abandoned him had no idea who they'd just crossed. The Mojave doesn't forgive easily, but it also doesn't keep secrets for long. By sunset, the temperature had dropped sharply, the sky burning in orange and red before slipping into a deep purple that stretched across the horizon. Coyotes began their distant calls, and the wind dragged thin layers of sand over the ground, burying tracks, footprints, and anything else that didn't belong to eternity. Frank Dalton lay on his back, ribs aching, breath shallow. The desert sky spun above him, scattered with the first bright stars of the night. His vision blurred around the edges, but he forced himself to stay awake. He knew the truth better than the kids who dumped him out there. The desert didn't wait until morning to take a man. Meanwhile, back in Ridgecrest, trouble was already stirring. Quietly, then suddenly, like a fuse being lit. Pete Holloway, owner of the Blue Coyote gas stop, found Frank's truck at 8:14 p.m. The door was wide open, the keys still in the ignition, and a smear of blood on the gravel. Pete wasn't a man who panicked easily. Decades running a remote gas station had carved the softness out of him. But something about the scene hit him in a place he didn't like. Frank Dalton didn't leave doors open. He didn't misplace keys, and he sure as hell didn't bleed alone. Frank didn't walk away from this, Pete muttered. He pulled out his phone and called the only man who would understand immediately, Harlan Briggs. Harlan picked up on the first ring. When Pete told him what he'd found, there was no swearing, no shouting, just a long, slow exhale. "Send me a picture." Pete took one of the blood, one of the open door, and another of the keys. 30 seconds later, Harlan had forwarded the images to nearly 40 men, riders who shared the same roads, the same scars, and the same loyalty to Frank. None of them needed an explanation. The message beneath the photo was clear. Brother missing. Move. Now. By 9 p.m., engines rumbled in the dark parking lot of the gas station. First 3 riders, then 6, then a dozen. By 9:22, more than 40 bikers stood forming a loose semicircle, headlights slicing through the desert night like blades of light. No one joked. No one smoked. They didn't come for a drink or a chat. They came because Frank Dalton's truck was sitting empty, and good men don't disappear without leaving noise in their wake. Harlan stepped forward, holding Frank's dog tags. Pete had found them near the pumps, half buried under dust. He raised them toward the group. "This didn't fall off," he said quietly. A low growl rolled through the crowd. Not anger yet, something deeper. That tight feeling in the chest kind of dread men get when something sacred is touched. "They took him into the Mojave," Harlan continued. "No water, no vehicle. He didn't walk out on his own." One biker spat into the sand. "Who did it?" Harlan turned the dog tags over in his hand. "Whoever it was, they made 2 mistakes," another rider asked. "What's the first?" "They hurt a veteran." "And the second?" Harlan slipped the dog tags into his pocket and looked out toward the dark desert. "They forgot he's one of ours." Pete motioned for the group to follow him around the back of the station, where faint tire tracks curved off the main road. The wind had softened their edges, but hadn't erased them yet. "They were in a hurry," Pete said. "Took a service trail going east." Harlan crouched, brushing the sand with the back of his hand. 2-hour head start, maybe more. One of the bikers stepped forward. "Frank saved my life once. I don't care how far they went. We're bringing him back." Another nodded. "He fixed my bike in the middle of the desert when no one else would. I'm not leaving him out there." Harlan stood and raised his arm. "Mount up." Engines roared to life, filling the Mojave with thunder. 40 headlights pointed east, toward the same trail the kidnappers had taken hours earlier. Someone asked, "And what about the men who dumped him out there?" Harlan swung onto his bike and tightened his grip on the handlebars. "We'll deal with them," he said. "The road will show us how." Then, with a surge of dust and noise, 40 bikers tore into the desert night. And the Mojave, for the first time that evening, felt less empty. The desert at night feels like another planet. The air is colder, sharper. The silence is so heavy it presses on your chest. But the engines cut through all of it as the 40 riders tore across the service road, their headlights bouncing off rocks, brush, and loose sand. Dust rose behind them in long, ghostly trails. The Mojave didn't usually see this much movement after dark, not unless something had gone wrong. And something had gone very, very wrong. Harlan rode at the front, low in his seat, eyes locked on the faint tire marks that wove across the dusty trail. The wind had softened them, but not enough. Whoever had taken Frank wasn't smart enough to hide their tracks, or they thought the desert was big enough to swallow the evidence. Harlan knew better. The desert hid things, yes, but it also revealed them when the right men looked. They rode in silence for nearly 20 minutes until the trail split near a dried-out arroyo. The tracks veered left, down into a shallow basin where shrubs grew tangled and scraggly. Harlan slowed his bike, lifted a fist in the air. 40 engines went quiet at once, a synchronized silence that made the desert feel even larger. They dismounted. Only the soft ticking of cooling engines broke the quiet. A rider named Colt knelt beside the tracks. "Same tread pattern," he murmured. "Pickup truck, heavy, probably carrying at least 4 men." Another rider pointed ahead. "Footprints, deep ones. Someone was dragged." That tightened every jaw in the group. Harlan followed the footprints with the beam of his flashlight. 2 sets of steps, uneven and staggered, like someone being pulled against his will. The tracks led over a rise of sand, then vanished into the darkness, where the land dropped toward a shallow ravine. He was alive when they brought him out here, Colt said. He's alive now, Harlan answered, not allowing any alternative. They continued on foot for a short distance until the moonlight revealed something half buried in a patch of sand. "Hold up," called one of the men. Harlan walked over slowly, kneeling beside the object. It was a boot. Frank's boot. Older leather, worn at the heel, the kind he'd patched up himself more times than anyone could count. The sand held a faint outline of his foot where it had been pulled free. The group fell into an uneasy silence. Colt swallowed. They dumped him here. Harlan didn't speak for several seconds. He brushed the sand off the boot gently, as if touching something sacred. "This means he crawled," he finally said. "He didn't just lie down and wait. He moved." "Which direction?" someone asked. They scanned the ground. Sand, broken shrubs, loose gravel. Then Colt pointed to a faint depression leading toward the ravine. "There," he said. "He followed the moon." It was exactly what Frank would do. A medic, a survivalist, a man who'd lived through jungles and deserts long before any of them were born. Harlan stood and held up the boot. "This is our line," he said. "From here forward, every minute counts." They returned to the bikes, hearts pounding now, not from fear, but urgency. Engines roared again as they descended the basin, following the faint trail Frank had left behind with the last of his strength. Every rock, every bush, every broken branch was a clue. 10 minutes later, one of the riders braked hard and motioned frantically. Harlan sped up, stopping beside him. "What is it?" The rider pointed to a cluster of rocks. Something gleamed between them, a metal chain. Frank's dog tags. The second set. He always wore 2. The chain had snapped during the struggle or during the crawl. The metal caught the moonlight, unmistakable and cold. Harlan's hand trembled as he picked it up. "He was here," he whispered, "maybe an hour ago. 2 at most." Another rider shouted, "This way!" They ran toward him and found more signs. Scuffed sand, a dent in the dirt where someone had fallen, dried blood on the tip of a cactus spine. Frank had been fighting the desert, and the desert had left breadcrumbs. Harlan mounted his bike again. "No stopping," he growled. "We find him before the cold does." 40 engines ignited once more, their rumble shaking the quiet night. Headlights sliced down into the ravine, chasing the fading traces of a man who refused to die quietly. The desert might not hide everything, but it didn't give up its wounded easily. And somewhere ahead, alone, injured, and running out of time, Frank Dalton was waiting. The desert sharpened as the bikers rode deeper into the ravine, the moonlight carving pale rivers of silver across the sand. Joshua trees stretched their twisted arms toward the sky, and the wind whistled through the rocks like the whisper of something ancient. The Mojave felt older here, harsher, less forgiving. Frank Dalton had been fighting this place for hours, and the place was starting to win. Harlan pushed his bike harder, the engine growling as gravel spat from under his wheels. The ravine widened ahead, rising into jagged cliffs that cast long shadows across the trail. The tire marks, once faint, now grew fresher, less wind-blown, less fragmented. "We're close," Colt shouted over the engine noise. But close to what? Exactly. The men who had taken Frank didn't know the desert. Their tracks zigzagged erratically, like they were lost or panicking. Deep grooves where they'd slammed the brakes. Sharp turns, even a place where they'd gotten stuck briefly, the wheels digging into soft sand. "They had no idea where they were going," said Dawson, one of the veteran riders. "City boys." "Good," Harlan replied. "The Mojave doesn't like amateurs." The group reached a small plateau and paused. The trail dipped sharply ahead into a narrow canyon, a perfect place for men to dump something, or someone, they didn't want found. The engines went silent again. The bikers listened, not to the wind, or coyotes, or shifting sand, but for the sound of anything human, a groan, a cry, a laugh, a drunken argument, and then they heard it. Voices, distant, faint, echoing along the canyon walls, not Frank's. You hear that? Colt whispered. Harlan nodded. They're still here. The 40 riders dismounted, spreading out across the plateau, moving like men who had done this before. Not in deserts, but in back alleys, small towns, parking lots behind bars and truck stops. Situations where one wrong move turned into a funeral. Flashlights cut through the darkness as the group descended the canyon on foot. The voices grew louder, careless, drunken laughter mixed with the pop of beer cans opening. And then the light from a small campfire flickered into view. 4 young men sat around it, music blasting from a truck speaker, the same truck Pete had described. Its bed was empty now, no sign of Frank. The boys looked relaxed, unbothered, as if the desert were just a backdrop to their stupidity. One of them tossed a beer can onto the sand. Dude, I can't believe we left that old fossil out here. Bet he's a bag of bones by now. More laughter. Another raised his beer. To the desert. Best dumpster in the country. They clinked their cans together. Then a deep voice behind them said, You boys picked the wrong trash. The laughter froze. 4 heads turned. And the bikers stepped out of the darkness like ghosts made of leather and steel. The young men scrambled to their feet. Who the hell are you people? Colt stepped forward first, flashlight angled up just enough to illuminate the patch on his vest. A brotherhood, he said, one you stepped on tonight. Harlan joined him, eyes locked on the tallest of the boys, the same sunburned kid who had shoved Frank at the gas station. Where is he? Harlan asked. The boy swallowed, hard. Who? Harlan didn't blink. You know who. The boy's hand shook as he gestured vaguely to the dark. He was alive when we left him. I swear, he was breathing. And you thought that was good enough? Colt growled. The boy stuttered, stepping back until his spine hit the hood of the truck. Look, we didn't mean to. He grabbed my shirt. He asked you to let go, Harlan said. I know exactly how he said it. Calm, respectful. And you boys didn't return the favor. The skinny one tried to speak, but a biker named Ramos cut him off. Don't talk, just point. Where did you leave him? The 4 men froze again, but this time out of fear, real fear, the kind that drains a man's face of all color. Finally, the sunburned one raised a trembling hand and pointed toward a narrow wash deeper inside the canyon. There, he whispered. We left him there. Harlan stared at him for a full 5 seconds, letting the weight of that answer settle in the boy's stomach like lead. Then he turned to the group. Mount up, he ordered. Frank's ahead. The bikers rushed to their bikes, engines roaring back to life, echoing so violently in the canyon that the boys covered their ears. Harlan paused only once, looking back at them. You stay right here, he said. We'll be back. And the look in his eyes made it clear, when they returned, the desert wouldn't be the only one settling debts. The canyon grew colder as the bikers pushed deeper into it, the engines roaring against stone walls that rose like dark cliffs on either side. The moon drifted behind a stretch of thin clouds, dimming the light and casting the ravine into a silver-gray gloom. Shadows stretched across the sand, twisting like fingers trying to pull at the riders' tires. Harlan rode at the front, jaw clenched, eyes sharp, scanning every rise and dip in the terrain. He wasn't listening to the engines or the desert wind anymore. He was listening for something smaller, something fragile. A cough, a groan, a breath, anything. The wash split into 3 narrow channels. Colt stopped beside him. Tracks go every which way here. Wind must have picked up. Harlan's stomach tightened. Time was draining fast. The desert swallowed warmth like it swallowed sound. And Frank, 79 years old, beaten, dehydrated, didn't have the strength to wait forever. Ramos rode up behind them. We need to spread out. No, Harlan answered immediately. We don't split. Not tonight. He revved once, the sound sharp in the cold air. Stay tight. Move slow. Look for anything that doesn't belong. They rolled down the left channel first, careful, deliberate, scanning every inch of ground illuminated by their headlights. Sand, rocks, twisted brush. Nothing. They doubled back and tried the center channel. Another half-mile. More nothing. Tension cracked across the group. Men shifted in their seats. Engines idled low, uncertain. The desert, once again, felt endless. Then, just as they circled toward the rightmost path, Colt lifted a hand. "Stop!" he shouted. The bikes halted instantly. Colt jumped off his bike and walked toward a strange shape in the sand. Not big, not obvious, but different. A disturbance where the sand formed a shallow crescent, a handprint, small, weak, dragging. Harlan was beside him in seconds. He crouched, touching the indentation gently. "He crawled," Harlan murmured. Ramos pointed ahead. "There's more. Look." They followed the trail. Handprints, knee marks, a smudge where someone had collapsed sideways. The pattern carried on, pausing in uneven intervals, each spot showing less strength than the last. Frank had fought for every inch. The bikers' engines quieted to a soft, uneasy rumble as they moved forward, headlights scanning the ravine walls. Then Colt yelled again, this time with a sharpness that cut the air. "Here! Over here!" The riders braked hard, sand sprayed, boots hit the ground. Frank Dalton lay slumped against a boulder, his body half curled as if trying to shield itself from the cold. His shirt was torn, his knuckles scraped raw, his lips cracked, his breath shallow, but he was breathing. Harlan rushed forward, dropping to his knees. "Frank! Frank!" For a moment, nothing happened. Then Frank's eyelids fluttered, barely. His voice came out as a whisper, rough as sandpaper. "Knew you'd come." Harlan swallowed hard, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We're here. You're safe now." Ramos knelt beside him, checking his pulse. "Weak, but steady. He's dehydrated, hypothermic. We need to get him warmed up." Frank tried to speak again. They left me." "We know," Harlan said, his tone darkening, "and they're going to answer for it." Frank shook his head weakly. "Don't kill them. They're stupid kids, not murderers." Harlan clenched his jaw. "They're damn close." Frank's fingers tightened around Harlan's wrist, surprisingly strong for a man on the edge of collapse. "Please." Harlan closed his eyes. When he opened them, his voice was steadier. "All right, no killing, but they're not walking away clean." Colt handed Harlan a thermal blanket from his saddlebag. They wrapped Frank carefully, lifting him slow, supporting his head and spine. Several riders formed a protective circle, shielding him from wind and cold. Frank blinked at the lights surrounding him. "Never thought I'd see this many bikes again." Harlan smiled for the first time that night. Small, tight, but real. "Hell, Frank, half the county would have come if they'd known." Ramos nodded. "You're family, and family doesn't stay lost." Frank's throat tightened. His eyes glossed with something he hadn't felt in years, not since the war, not since the funerals of brothers whose names still echoed in his dreams. Gratitude, belonging, survival. As the bikers carried him gently toward Harlan's bike, Frank whispered, "The desert tried to take me." Harlan looked down at him. "But the road brought you back." The engines roared to life again, 40 throats of thunder breaking the desert silence. And for the first time that night, the Mojave felt less like a graveyard and more like a road home. The desert wind shifted as the riders roared back toward the dirt road, now carrying Frank securely wrapped, riding behind Ramos on the widest, softest seat in the convoy. The engines weren't running angry anymore. They were running with purpose, sharp, focused, unified. Behind them, the canyon faded into darkness. Ahead, the tracks of the young punks cut a clear trail toward an old service road, one that led straight to a half-abandoned RV camp that locals used for cheap drinking, cheap fights, and cheaper decisions. Harlan slowed as they neared the outskirts of the camp. Broken neon lights flickered over rusted trailers. A dusty pickup sat crooked, doors open. Up ahead, laughter spilled from a fire pit. Loud, sloppy, nervous. They weren't celebrating. They were trying to forget. Ramos pulled up beside Harlan. "They're still here, didn't even leave the county." "Cowards rarely run far," Harlan replied. Colt cracked his neck. Plan? Simple. Harlan's voice darkened. We make sure they never forget what they did tonight. He turned his gaze back to the group of riders behind him. 39 men sat in silence, waiting. Their headlights cut long beams across the dirt like spears of judgment. No weapons, Harlan reminded them. Frank asked for mercy. We'll give him mercy, but we won't give these boys comfort. A low rumble of agreement moved through the line. Then Harlan raised 2 fingers. It was enough. Engines thundered in unison as the bikers rolled forward, slow and deliberate, the way storms roll in across flatlands. Gravel crunched, shadows stretched. The laughter at the fire died instantly as the young men turned. One of them, thin, shirt half open, cheap beer in hand, stood up too fast. The hell? Who are... Harlan killed his engine. Silence hit the camp like a hammer, then boots hit the dirt, then more. And more. Within seconds, the bikers formed a wide circle around the fire pit, every man standing shoulder to shoulder, leather creaking, patches catching the firelight. The punks froze, 5 of them total, each one suddenly smaller than he'd ever realized. Colt stepped forward. Evening, boys. The tallest punk swallowed hard. We didn't do nothing wrong. Ramos raised a brow. Funny. Because we just picked up an old man you left to die. No, look, he started it, okay? He mouthed off. Colt laughed once, a dry, humorless sound. Frank Dalton mouthed off. He can barely hear, let alone start a fight. The punk with the beer backed up until his calves hit the log behind him. We didn't mean to hurt him, we just pushed him a little. He fell. Harlan repeated slowly, stepping forward. And your solution was to dump him in the desert. The boys said nothing. They couldn't. Shame had already stolen their voices. Harlan looked at each one, his expression unreadable. Then he spoke, not loud, but with a tone that cut deeper than shouting ever could. You could have killed him. You left a veteran, an old man, under the desert sky with nothing but bruises and sand in his lungs. You're lucky tonight isn't a funeral. The tallest boy trembled. We're sorry. Doesn't matter if you're sorry, Colt said, voice cold. What matters is what you do next, Harlan nodded. Drop your phones. Keys, too. The boys hesitated. Ramos cracked his knuckles. Now! The items hit the dirt one by one. Good, Harlan said. Now stand there, don't move. The bikers turned as one mass, 40 riders walking back toward their machines. The boys exhaled in shaky relief, until the first engine roared, then the second, then all 40. The ground vibrated, dust rose in waves, the headlights swung wide, forming a blinding arc around the terrified men. Harlan revved once, slow, controlled. This, he said over the engines, is what it feels like when judgment closes in. The riders circled, engines screaming, tires kicking dirt into the air. The boys trembled, shielding their faces from the storm of grit and exhaust. No one touched them, no one laid a hand on them. But the sound, the power, the overwhelming presence of 40 bikers moving as one, it broke whatever arrogance they had left. One kid collapsed to his knees, sobbing. Another shouted apologies into the wind. A third begged them to stop. Then, as suddenly as it began, the engines fell silent. Dust settled. Harlan dismounted and stepped forward again. You'll drive Frank's truck back to town tomorrow, he said. You'll pay for his medical bills, and you'll look him in the eye when you apologize. The boys nodded, frantic, terrified, eager. And listen to me carefully, Harlan continued. If any one of you ever lays a hand on someone weaker than you again, we won't be merciful a second time. The punks didn't speak, only nodded over and over, like children being spared by something ancient. Harlan turned to his men. Mount up. We're done. Engines fired once more. This time, the sound wasn't anger. It was closure. As they rode off, Ramos glanced back. Think they'll learn. Harlan exhaled. Tonight, they met something they'll never forget. And that's enough. Morning found the desert softer than it had been the night before. The sun rose slow, gentle, spilling gold across the sand like someone trying to warm something fragile. Frank sat outside the small clinic on a wooden bench, a blanket over his shoulders, sipping the worst coffee he'd ever tasted. He loved it. Every breath hurt a little, but he was alive, and that meant something. Harlan pulled up first, his engine idling low. He didn't say a word as he sat beside the old man. They watched the road together the way only riders do, not as asphalt, but as memories stretching out in front of them. You didn't have to do all this, Frank murmured. Harlan shrugged. They crossed a line. We corrected it. Frank chuckled softly. Boys always think strength is loud. And you showed us again. It doesn't have to be, Harlan replied. A dusty pickup approached from the highway. Slow, hesitant, carrying 5 young men who looked like they hadn't slept a second. They parked crookedly and stepped out one by one, each holding something in their hands. Frank's jacket, his canteen, his folded-up hat, even the old pocket knife he'd carried since '68. Not one of the boys could look him in the eyes. Finally, the tallest one forced his voice out. We're sorry, sir, for everything. Frank studied them quietly. Not judging, not forgiving, just seeing them for who they were in that moment. Scared, ashamed, young. Just don't make the same mistake twice, he said gently. They nodded over and over, tears gathering where pride used to sit. Harlan didn't threaten them again. Colt didn't growl. Ramos didn't crack his knuckles. The roar of the engines last night had already said everything that needed to be said. The boys got back into their truck and drove away, slower, humbler, changed. Frank let out a long breath. You think they'll remember this? He asked. Harlan stood, adjusting his gloves. Son, he looked out toward the desert, toward the empty road waiting to swallow the day. Nights like that carve themselves into a man, whether he wants them to or not. Frank smiled, tired, grateful, alive. The bikes fired up behind them, one by one, until their rumble filled the morning like a heartbeat returning after a long silence. Before climbing onto his ride, Harlan turned back and said, The road gives every man a lesson. Last night they got theirs, and we got ours. Frank nodded. Which one? That even when the world forgets a good man, Harlan said, brothers don't. The convoy rolled out slow, engines humming steady as they headed east, leaving only dust, sunlight, and a story the desert would remember long after every one of them was gone. Because justice doesn't always ride with violence. Sometimes it rides with presence, with loyalty, with 40 engines moving as one in the dark. And somewhere deep in the desert, the old tracks from the night before were already fading, but the memory of what happened would not. Not for the boys, not for the riders, not for Frank, and not for the road. Some stories ride with you long after the engines go quiet. Frank Dalton's was one of them, not because it was violent, not because it was dramatic, but because it reminded every man on that road of something easy to forget in a world that moves too fast. Respect still matters, brotherhood still matters, and the weak are never abandoned, not when the right men are watching. If you listened closely tonight, you heard more than a tale about bikers and a desert that almost took an old man. You heard a code, the kind spoken without words. A code that keeps riders alive and keeps the road honest. Maybe you have a story like that. A moment when the night felt heavier than it should, when a stranger showed kindness, when a mistake almost cost too much, or when the road taught you something you never forgot. If this kind of storytelling speaks to you, stick around. On this channel, we don't chase trends, we chase truth. We chase the moments that shape men and the roads that remember them. If you want to keep riding with us, consider subscribing and hitting the like button. It helps these stories travel farther, to the riders who need them, and the ones who thought they'd been forgotten. And if you've lived a road story worth telling, share it in the comments or send it privately using the link in the description. Who knows? Maybe your ride becomes the next chapter we bring to life here. Until then, ride safe, ride true. And remember, the road never forgets.